It's the Genesis album, even fans themselves sometimes forget, but it just might be the most important one they ever made. Now, Trespass didn't sell millions, it didn't chart, it didn't produce hits, nor did it feature the lineup that most people associate with the band's commercial peak. But for some, it contains the first clear blueprint of what progressive rock would become. So the question is worth asking. Did Genesis invent prog with Trespass? Let's take a measured, honest look at that claim. So Trespass was released in October of 1970, and it's often treated as the kind of Genesis 1.5, more evolved than that 1969 debut from Genesis to Revelation, but still years away from the theatrical full-bodied heights of Foxtrot or Selling England by the Pound. Now, the lineup itself was in a transitional state as well. We've got Peter Gabriel on vocals and flute, Tony Banks on keys, Mike Rutherford on bass and guitar, and we've got Anthony Phillips on lead guitar, and also John Mayhew on drums. Now, this is the only Genesis album that he would appear on. Now, the album marked the departure of founding guitarist Phillips, who left just before its release, and would soon be replaced by Steve Hackett. Similarly, Phil Collins joined shortly after the album was completed, ushering in the band's most famous era. But here's the thing. Although it was made by a version of the band that would vanish almost as soon as it arrived, Trespass laid down many of the defining characteristics that fans and critics would later associate with progressive rock. Those extended song structures, the shifting time signatures, those literary themes, and the emphasis on atmosphere and detail over immediacy or hooks. Now, that in itself really is significant. Now, to argue that Trespass invented progressive rock is quite bold. After all, King Crimson had already released In the Court of the Crimson King in 1969. And both Yes and Van der Graaf Generator were experimenting with classical influences and odd meters before Genesis entered the conversation. But what Trespass achieved, in its own quieter, less aggressive way, was the articulation of a particular approach to this genre, where King Crimson fused jazz and the avant-garde with jarring contrasts. Genesis leaned towards pastoral melodies, gentle build-ups, and a kind of English romanticism that set them apart. They weren't trying to be heavy, but rather thoughtful and detailed. Now, Tony Banks once said, "We were never really rock and roll. We were more comfortable thinking about moods and structures." Now, that approach is all over Trespass. In the tracks like Stagnation or Looking for Someone, you can hear a clear move away from the verse-chorus model and towards long-form compositions that really unfold in movements before your very eyes. These aren't experiments in the sense of free-form jams or complex virtuosity. They're carefully arranged, they're poetic, and for the most part, they are really quite restrained. And that's what makes the album so unusual. It's neither raw nor flashy. It's contemplative. Some might say even reserved, but it's also highly ambitious. Looking at the tracks themselves, it opens up with Looking for Someone, and this sets the tone. And it's a slow-building, introspective piece that marries Gabriel's expressive vocal delivery with the shifting dynamics and layered instrumentation.
Looking for someone, I guess I'm doing that.
Doesn't sound like a single, and it's not trying to be one at all. White Mountain is up next, and it's really almost a musical fable, this one. There's lyrics about loyalty and power struggles between wolves, played out with delicate acoustic guitars and atmospheric keyboards.
Howling for blood when I lead on the pack, plunging.
This is prog by theme and execution, but without the bombast. Visions of Angels leans heavily into the pastoral side of Genesis.
Visions of angels all
full of major key flourishes and melodic optimism. But it also feels quite hesitant sometimes, perhaps reflecting a band still learning what it wanted to be. The production handled by John Anthony is polite but unremarkable. It's one of the areas where Trespass really does fall short. The performance is very clearly thoughtful, but they don't always have the presence that they deserve. Then there's Stagnation, arguably the most influential track on the record. Spanning over 8 minutes, it offers really the most fully realised glimpse of what Genesis would become. The use of space, the dynamic shifts, the recurring motifs. These ideas would later be refined on The Musical Box or Supper's Ready, but they're all here in their embryonic forms. Finally, The Knife. This closes the album with a blast of energy, and this really feels like a different band entirely.
Tell me my life is about to begin. Tell me that I'm a hero. Promise me all of your violent dreams. Light up your body with anger.
It's aggressive, urgent and confrontational. It became a life staple throughout the band's history, and quite rightly so. Now it hints at what Genesis could do when they pushed themselves really out of their comfort zone. So let's go back to that original question. Did Genesis invent prog with Trespass? Now, if you're talking about being first chronologically, the answer quite simply is no, they didn't. King Crimson, The Knives, and arguably the Moody Blues has already laid the foundations. In fact, by the time that Trespass was released, Emerson, Lake and Palmer had also debuted, and Yes had released Time in a Word. But if we consider inventing in a different sense as shaping a certain identity within the genre, then the album's influence becomes really much harder to dismiss. Genesis were never trying to emulate Crimson or Yes. They had a literary, introspective quality that was rooted in English folk, classical motifs, and the desire to tell stories. Peter Gabriel's lyrics on Trespass are more allegorical than poetic, more whimsical than cryptic. Now, the result is an album that feels more like a theatrical play than a psychedelic jam, in fairness. Music critic Chris Welsh once noted that Genesis brought a gentler, more thoughtful approach to progressive music. And really, Trespass is the first real example of that. It wasn't loud and it wasn't immediate, and in 1970 that probably worked against it. Now, at the time of its release, Trespass received little attention in the UK, though it found a surprisingly strong following in Belgium and Italy. These are two countries that would go on to embrace progressive rock with unusual enthusiasm. As I said earlier, the album didn't chart in the UK, it didn't make much noise in the press. It was, to put it plainly, overlooked. But here's the thing, over the years it's grown in stature, not necessarily in terms of sales, but definitely in terms of reputation. Peter Gabriel, looking back, once said, "We were still finding our voice, but there were ideas in there that really felt important." Tony Banks has called it a turning point, the moment when the band started writing music without worrying about singles or what the label thought. Now, in that sense, and that sense alone, Trespass may not have invented progressive rock, but it did something just as significant. It gave the genre a quieter, more reflective voice, one that didn't need to be loud, or to be thoughtful, or chaotic to be interesting. So, does this album hold the DNA of progressive rock? Well, for me, yes it does. Well, a version of it. A version that values melody, structure, mood and imagination over commercial appeal. It's not the album that built the genre's cathedral, but it might have laid down one of the first bricks in its foundation, and that's really important. It's really a strange, elegant record. It's full of promise, sometimes frustratingly tentative, and occasionally brilliant. For some fans, it's really where the story begins. Not with fireworks, but with that quiet confidence that said, we're going to try something different. Now, in that way, maybe Genesis didn't invent progressive rock, but they made it their own. And Trespass was the moment they started doing exactly that. Now, I shot a reaction video for one of the tracks from this album, and that became a fan favourite right up to their very last ever gig. Now watch that one next, and I'll see you over there.